January 14th, 1944. Bremen, Germany. Frost covered the yard like ash. The ground was hard enough to ring under boots, each step echoing between corrugated walls lined with ice. Above, the chimneys of the Bremen power complex sent up faint plumes, too thin to warm the air. Inside a small steel shed, engineer Karl Voss worked in silence, his breath forming clouds that drifted across the lamplight. The flame wavered, catching the edges of scattered detonator shells. Some cracked open, others half-assembled, their copper threads glinting dull gold. The bench before him was layered with failure. 7 prototypes lay still, each one a question. The stopwatch beside them ticked slow and steady, marking the delay intervals that refused to stay uniform. Voss adjusted his wireframe glasses and traced a fingertip across a fuse cap, scarred by heat. The readings from the last test had drifted again. 6 seconds late, then 9. Then no detonation at all. The flaw was real. It wasn't mechanical fatigue, it was chemical variance in the new primer compound, unpredictable at low temperatures, the kind that factory supervisors hated and field engineers feared. Beyond the frost-glazed window, truck engines idled. Headlights flickered through the wire fence, cutting across the mist in brief white arcs. A guard's boots moved past, rhythm steady, rifle slung low. Somewhere deeper in the complex, a generator hummed like a slow heartbeat. Voss noted the rhythm, then returned to the fuses. He wasn't supposed to think beyond precision. His task was correction, not innovation. But the reports from the Eastern Front lingered in his mind. Allied engineers clearing unexploded bombs within hours, rebuilding runways in less than a day. A uniform fuse made clearance predictable. A flawed one might not. He marked another note in his ledger. Temperature, delay, variance, and stopped. His pencil hovered. The lantern flickered once more, then steadied, revealing the small tremor in his hand. The officer in charge, Hauptmann Richter, would arrive by dawn. The man preferred numbers neat and identical, signatures stacked like bricks. Anything else was waste. But a staggered detonation pattern could choke Allied airfields longer than any precision strike. It could turn every crater into a waiting trap, each one uncertain, each one feared. Voss stared at the stopwatch again. Its second hand swept clean, untroubled. He pressed the detonator switch for the next test. The charge clicked, then held. 4 seconds, 5, nothing. He waited. On 7, the blast arrived, a muffled thud from the test pit beyond the wall. Dust lifted from the rafters. The delay was irregular again. He exhaled through his teeth. A defect, yes, but an intelligent one. By 03:47 hours, the yard had fallen quiet. The trucks shut down. The air settled back into frost and metal. Voss leaned against the bench, the lantern's flame shrinking as the oil thinned. His logbook remained open beside the last fuse, the words incomplete. One entry read, delay consistent under error. Possible field advantage. He knew what the officer would demand. Correction, conformity, signature. He also knew what this imperfection could do once scattered across an airfield at night. He closed the ledger, wiped his hands on the hem of his coat, and turned toward the silent trucks waiting beyond the fence. Steam curled from their exhausts, dissolving into the black sky. Somewhere, a bell marked the shift change, distant and hollow. The stopwatch still ticked on the bench, measuring nothing now, just the distance between hesitation and obedience. By dawn, Voss would hand over his report. The delay data would be marked acceptable. The flaw would remain uncorrected. Months later, Allied engineers clearing runways across northern France would describe the same phenomenon. Bombs that waited. 10 seconds, 30, sometimes an hour. Each sound that followed a silence made men flinch long after the last detonation. Industrial systems are not built on perfection. They win through endurance, through the repetition of almost correct machines that never truly fail. Would you have fixed the fuse, or let the flaw live? Before the war, Karl Voss's world was measured in revolutions per minute. His days began with the hum of turbines along the Elbe, the rhythm of water pumps feeding the shipyards. He preferred the company of machines to men. Steel obeyed rules, and rules could be trusted. In his small maintenance shed outside Hamburg, every wrench had a numbered place, every coil a label in his ledger. His mother once said he was born with rhythm in his ears. She meant music, but what Karl heard was pattern, steam pressure, piston cycles, the pulse of voltage through copper lines. When the draft order came, it didn't send him to the front. It sent him deeper into machinery. The Reich's Ministry for Armaments needed precision workers, and Karl's reputation for method made him a candidate for the Luftwaffe's fuse laboratories. He traded turbine noise for the sharper scent of detonators and solder. The workroom near Bremen felt colder than any dockside morning. No sunlight, only the white glare of lamps and the hiss of cooling agents. His old notebooks now filled with voltages, delay readings, and failures. The entries no longer recorded maintenance, but design. Machines made to destroy. He found his rhythm again. Measure, file, test, repeat. The ritual steadied him, even as the meaning of the work hollowed out. He never wrote opinions in his reports, only results. The system rewarded silence, and he understood that silence was a form of survival. But fatigue crept in, not the kind that dulled his hands, but one that pressed into his thoughts. Each improvement he perfected returned through reports written in coded language. Detonation, yield, satisfactory. He knew what those words meant. Somewhere, a man was not walking home. When the fuse trials began to fail, Karl didn't react with anger. He watched. The detonators behaved like living things, some precise, others hesitant, a few completely inert. At first he suspected corrosion, or a flaw in the primer compound. But the error pattern shifted with the weather. Readings stable in the morning drifted by nightfall. The inconsistency wasn't mechanical, it was environmental. A bimetal coil inside the timing unit expanded unpredictably under temperature changes. A small imperfection, invisible to the eye, measurable only by patience. He logged the data over 3 nights. Temperature, pressure, delay, interval. The chart curved irregularly. It shouldn't have. Each deviation widened the more he repeated the test. The more he measured, the more alive the fault became. Chaos masquerading as science. The fuse, in theory, was broken. Yet in application, it could become something else. A pattern of uncertainty that would make any field technician hesitate before touching a bomb. It could multiply fear. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. The system demanded perfection. It did not tolerate useful disorder. But Karl saw a strange symmetry in the failure. Machines built for total control often depended on fractions of error. Systems breathed because of slight misalignments. A perfect engine stalls. An imperfect one endures. He cleaned his tools, arranged them by size, and wiped the oil from his hands. Outside, frost gathered along the window frame. The factory hum continued, a steady vibration through the concrete floor. He stood there, listening, counting the beats as he once counted turbine cycles. The flaw waited in his notes. It had no name, no entry in the manual. Just a number, written in faint pencil. He could erase it tonight, fix the coil, restore order. Or he could let the system absorb this small pulse of unpredictability, a delay that might outlive its maker. By dawn, he decided nothing. The lamp burned low. The stopwatch on the bench kept ticking, indifferent to choice. Even precision has a conscience. It asks questions quietly, beneath the sound of machines. Would you have erased the error, or trusted the flaw to do its work? By winter 1944, the factory no longer sounded human. It breathed through pistons and conveyor belts, a constant, mechanical rhythm that began before dawn and ended only when power failed. Steam drifted from vents in slow columns. The air inside the foundry was dense with the smell of graphite, hot oil, and dust. Each worker performed a motion that linked invisibly to the next. Pour, cool, grind, stamp. Molten steel into molds, brass into shells, precision into repetition. The rhythm never broke. Karl Voss watched from his station on the mezzanine, ledger in hand. Below him, crates lined the floor like tiles, everyone destined for an airfield on the channel front. Each contained the same component. The delay fuse he'd refined through nights of calculation. Each bore his initials stamped into the corner plate. The factory foreman called it efficiency. Karl called it fragility disguised as order. One cracked bearing in a rail car, one frozen junction in a freight yard, one misread number on a form. And the entire flow of the system would stall. He traced his pencil down the ledger, marking each outbound shipment by train number. Every delay fuse from his section would feed the Luftwaffe's aerial ordnance for Calais. Timing defined value. Too soon, and the blast lost its reach. Too late, and Allied engineers cleared the field before detonation. Command wanted obedience to formula. Detonation intervals exact, consistent, mathematical. But precision, Karl thought, was a luxury of stable conditions. And nothing in wartime Europe was stable. Beyond the factory walls, fog rolled across the rail yard. The cranes moved through it like gray shapes in water. Chains clanked. Freight cars filled with munitions drifted down side tracks, wheels screaming in short bursts before locking into place. Steam escaped from valves in brief sighs. Somewhere, a guard shouted through the haze, his voice muffled against the hum of diesel engines. Every link of the chain performed as expected, yet every link carried a margin of failure. The system's perfection existed only on paper. Karl returned to his bench. His logbooks spread across the table like maps of an unseen battlefield. Columns of resistance values, delay curves, and test anomalies. The data told a quiet truth. The system did not reward flexibility. It demanded alignment, even if the alignment led to fragility. His flaw, the temperature-induced delay variation, now lived in those numbers, hidden under layers of acceptable variance. No one else would notice. The report would pass review, but the effect would ripple outward through the supply chain, traveling by rail to depots, by convoy to airfields, by bomber to enemy soil. By midnight, the last train stood ready. Workers locked the crates into the freight cars, sealing each with wax and twine. The air smelled faintly of tar and coal. The signal lamp at the end of the platform blinked red, then green. Movement began again. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Karl leaned on the railing as the first locomotive exhaled and rolled forward, its steel wheels clanging against frozen rails. The vibration reached up through the metal floor. He knew the sequence that would follow. 2 days to Calais, sorting at depot, loading under airfield blackout, release by bomber over enemy territory. Each component, identical in design, would behave differently in the field. Some would detonate instantly. Others would wait, seconds, minutes, hours. The pattern of delay would stretch across time and geography like a slow echo. The factory returned to silence once the train departed. The cranes froze mid-rest. Lights dimmed. A draft moved through the empty corridor, stirring the papers on Karl's desk. He picked up the last page from his ledger. It bore a single notation beside the production total. Variance within tolerance. He closed the book, set down his pencil, and listened. Somewhere far beyond Bremen, the rhythm of the system continued. Wheels, valves, and decisions moving unseen through the dark. Machines do not question purpose. They only execute, and in that obedience lies both their strength and their blindness. By dawn, the yard would fill again. New crates, new trains, the same pattern repeating until the line broke from exhaustion. Perfection, Karl realized, was not what kept the system alive. It was the flaws that made it breathe. Would you have corrected the rhythm, or trusted the imperfection to keep the chain moving? By 05:40 a.m., the first warning came without alarm. Just a faint hiss beneath the clatter of the morning shift. A worker near the packing line stopped mid-motion, head tilted toward a crate stamped with red caution marks. The sound was brief, a slow release of pressure, almost like breath. Then a single click, hollow and dry. The men stepped back instinctively. Nothing followed. Silence pressed against the metal walls until even the steam valves seemed to hold still. Karl Voss arrived moments later, coat unbuttoned, gloves half on. He crouched beside the crate. The surface was cold but trembling faintly, a small pulse of vibration from within. He recognized the pattern, not detonation, not malfunction. The fuse inside had reactivated under temperature change. It had warmed, awakened, and stopped just short of ignition. He placed his hand on the lid, feeling for rhythm. The silence wasn't dead. It was suspended. Waiting. An officer entered. Hauptmann Richter, clipboard under his arm, voice clipped by impatience. The factory had no time for superstition. He called it static discharge, a fluke of cold metal meeting condensation. Seal it, move on, he ordered. The men obeyed, sealing the crate in wax and hauling it to the outbound rail queue. The hiss did not return. Richter ticked a box on his form. Order restored. But Karl remained near the empty space the crate had occupied, studying the frost on the floor. The heaters had switched on minutes before the noise. That was no coincidence. He returned to his bench, reopening his notes. Delay times had drifted again overnight. Longer, inconsistent, erratic. He ran a pencil down the column of figures. The pattern wasn't linear. It expanded under warmth, contracted in cold. The fuse had become sensitive not to time, but to its environment. He wrote a line in the margin. Delay dependent on ambient temperature. Unstable equilibrium. The words felt too alive. He crossed them out, replaced them with something less revealing. Thermal deviation, under review. Then he closed the book. Outside, the factory heaters groaned, metal ducts creaking as warm air crawled through the vents. The shift floor glowed faintly orange under the industrial lamps. Workers resumed their rhythm, lifting, sealing, stamping. The noise returned, swallowing the earlier unease. But beneath it, the same hiss came again. Not loud, not continuous. Just one brief exhale from a stack of crates waiting by the door. No one turned this time. Karl recorded each interval quietly. At 06:12 a.m., another unit delayed by 7 seconds beyond tolerance. At 06:34, 2/9. When the temperature reached full operating heat, the data drifted wider still. The variation was alive, unpredictable. To command, this would be failure. To Karl, it was potential. The kind of fault that could ripple through systems designed for control, turning precision into hesitation, safety into doubt. He adjusted his spectacles and began rewriting the production report. Each entry shortened, simplified. Delay within tolerance, repeated line after line. He stamped each page with the approval seal, the steel die pressing his initials into the paper. By 07 Sue, the forms were complete. The officer would find no irregularities. The numbers would pass the inspection chain without question. But in his private ledger, hidden beneath the false summary, Karl added a new note. Fuse delay reactive to heat. Possible tactical advantage, prolonged runway denial. He underlined it once, firmly. The heaters hummed. Frost melted from the windows, streaking down the glass in narrow trails. The floor trembled again as another train coupled to the loading dock. The factory rhythm resumed its steady beat. Obedient, relentless, unaware. Karl placed his ledger in the drawer and locked it. The key stayed in his hand for a long time. He didn't feel triumph, only the quiet awareness that something mechanical had crossed into instinct. A device now listened to its surroundings. It would wait, learn warmth, and strike when conditions aligned. Like a system teaching itself delay. By the next shipment, the crates bore his signature once more. The officer saw precision. Karl saw something else moving beneath the numbers. A machine that had learned uncertainty. The factory clock marked 07:20 a.m. Steam drifted upward, slow and calm, as if the building itself were breathing. Every system hides its echo, the faint reminder that control is never complete. Would you have silenced the warning, or listened to what it was trying to say? By midday, the air inside the production hall had thickened with heat and urgency. The morning frost had lifted from the rail yard outside, leaving the factory's steel girders slick and glistening under a pale sun. Somewhere in the distance, a whistle signaled the arrival of a new transport train. Inside, orderlies moved between the benches with crates stacked to their shoulders. The tempo of the day had changed, no longer patient, no longer methodical. Command had sent a directive. All fuse units were to be shipped to northern depots by nightfall. Karl Voss stood at his workstation, his coat folded neatly on the hook behind him. The ledger lay open, its columns marked in pencil from a long night of recalculation. Each line represented a fuse, each number a delay interval tested under conditions that no longer fit the timetable. Regulations required another round of calibration before shipment. Standard procedure, non-negotiable. But the request from command was stamped urgent, signed by an adjutant in Calais who had no patience for decimals or temperature ranges. The factory foreman, Richter, recited the order twice in his usual clipped tone. Departure in 6 hours. No exceptions. He walked away without waiting for acknowledgement. The moment the door closed, Karl exhaled slowly and turned toward his instruments. The readings on the bench told the truth no one wanted written. The fuse curve had drifted again. It no longer followed regulation delay margins. Under rising heat, the variance spread wide, unpredictable, alive. To correct it would mean halting the line, delaying the shipment, inviting inspection. To ignore it meant something else entirely, a new pattern of consequence. He traced a finger over the dials, the pointer trembling near the edge of tolerance. In his mind, the calculations unfolded like clockwork. A bomb dropped at 06 hours, detonating not on impact, but at 06:05. A 5-minute silence in which the ground crew, the medics, the engineers, the ones who always came running first, would arrive. Then the blast. The delay would not just destroy, it would teach fear. The kind that lingered long after the smoke cleared. Machines don't think. Men do. His father had said it once, years before the war, while repairing a turbine shaft at the docks. Karl remembered the sound of that workshop. The same rhythm, the same hum of industry, but without the purpose of death. The words stayed with him now, buried beneath the noise of the factory around him. He stared at the production board. 2 paths lay before him, both written in the same mechanical order. Calibrate or confirm. The forms left no space for conscience. A machine would have chosen calibration, the correction of error. But Karl wasn't a machine. He understood that systems built for uniformity could collapse under the weight of one deliberate imperfection. He picked up his pen. His hand didn't shake. The official report required a single phrase in the remarks section. Delay margin 0.1 sec. He inhaled once, slow and steady, and wrote the word confirmed. The pen scratched across the paper, sealing both the report and his silence. Outside, the air filled with the sound of locomotives coming to life. Pistons knocked, brakes hissed, chains clattered against couplers. The first train shuddered forward, wheels grinding over frost-stiff rails. Each crate loaded into its freight car carried his initials, his design, his decision. The vibrations from the floorboards climbed up through the soles of his boots, a reminder that the system had begun to move. Unstoppable, indifferent. He stood at his desk for a long time after the others left. The factory now quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the echo of engines in the distance. His hand hovered above the ledger. He could still change it, erase the entry, start again, fix the flaw. But the pencil stayed still. The choice was already made. Silence had replaced compliance. By dusk, the trains were gone. The factory lights dimmed. A single fuse prototype sat on his bench, marked with a faint line of grease. He turned it once in his palm and set it down. The metal felt warm, almost alive. Systems, he thought, endure not because they are perfect, but because someone, somewhere, chooses when not to follow the rule. Would you have signed the form or stopped the machine? January 16th, 1944. The yard outside Bremen lay under a thin crust of frost. Steel rails glinted pale in the weak light. Breath hung in the air, slow and heavy. At the far end of the siding, cranes lifted wooden crates one by one into waiting freight cars. The men moved carefully. Each box weighed more than it looked. Inside were delay-fused bombs, 312 in total. Their destinations printed in black ink. Calais Sector, Northern France. Karl Voss stood beside the manifest table, his gloved hands folded behind his back. The clipboard before him listed serial codes, resistance readings, and shipment designations. Every figure aligned perfectly. Every mark matched regulation. On paper, the system was flawless. But beneath the uppermost file, under the thick stack of signatures and seals, he slid a slim, unmarked logbook, his own. Its final entry described a truth no officer would ever read. Delay variance confirmed. Heat reactive instability. Do not correct. The officer in charge, Hauptmann Richter, arrived to sign the clearance. His boots struck the platform in steady rhythm, his breath leaving quick clouds in the cold. He gave the papers a cursory glance, nodded once, and stamped them with the Luftwaffe seal. Approved. Load complete, he said, before turning toward the siding to watch the convoy depart. The men saluted. Engines coughed awake, smoke curling through the air like worn fabric. Karl remained still, eyes on the rows of crates vanishing into the freight car's dark interior. He knew what lay within. Fuses that would not obey time, bombs that would sleep and wake according to the sky's temperature, scattering destruction across hours instead of seconds. A flaw disguised as precision. He hadn't built them for sabotage. Not consciously, but something in him refused correction. The system wanted uniformity. He had given it unpredictability. When the last crate rolled inside, the latch slammed shut. The guard waved the flag. The locomotive groaned and began to move, slow at first, then steady. The iron rhythm filled the yard, a sound of weight in motion. Frost cracked beneath the wheels. The train disappeared into the low fog toward the west. Karl lingered by the presses. The factory floor had emptied, leaving only the faint hum of the idle generators. Rows of workbenches stretched into shadow, each one marked by repetition. Spools, clamps, wire cutters, the residue of oil and graphite. He walked the aisle slowly, fingertips grazing the cold edges of metal. The air smelled of burnt lubricant and dust. Somewhere deep in the machine hall, a valve released a tired hiss. He stopped by his test bench. The dials still glowed faintly. Instruments waited for instruction, needles resting at 0. He began turning them off, one switch at a time. The hum receded, the lights dimmed, the silence deepened. It wasn't resignation, it was something quieter. A pause within the rhythm of obedience. Beyond the rail fence, dawn began to press through the haze. A pale orange line spread over the horizon, cutting through chimney smoke. The cranes stood motionless, their arms like frozen sentinels. For the first time in months, Karl felt no movement inside the factory walls, only stillness. He looked down at his empty hands, oil-stained, scarred from years of work, and thought of what they had just done. Not sabotage, not rebellion, just a choice left unspoken. Somewhere far ahead on that westbound train, his design would meet the cold air above France. Metal would heat, expand, and wait. The pattern of delay would unfold across the enemy's airfields in silence. He walked toward the door. Behind him, the machines remained dark, the test bench quiet. Ahead, the tracks disappeared into fog. The system had moved on without him. Industrial systems survived through the obedience of thousands and the hesitation of one. 3 days later, Bremen was quiet under a low ceiling of gray. The factory whistles sounded at dawn as always, a thin metallic cry that disappeared into the river fog. Conveyor lines resumed their rhythm. Presses struck in sequence. The war had not slowed, but in the communications office near the yard, a teletype printer clattered through the silence, spooling out a narrow ribbon of paper marked Urgent, Field Report, Northern France. Karl Voss stood alone by the desk as the machine stuttered, its steel arms hammering out words he already suspected. Allied engineers near Cherbourg had been clearing runways struck during the previous night's raid. At 07:42, a secondary blast occurred. Delayed, unpredicted. 2 casualties. No aircraft damage, but clearance operations halted. Then, hours later, another detonation. 6 hours after the first. The airfield shut down completely. Engineers refused to re-enter the zone. The report concluded with a single phrase. Enemy air operations delayed approximately 23 hours. He read it again, line by line. The timing intervals matched his failed coil sequence exactly. The deviation curve he had marked as within tolerance now repeated across an entire battlefield. His signature was nowhere on the paper, yet his work pulsed inside every figure. The factory would never see it that way. By noon, officers in the assembly division were already calling it a triumph of precision. The fuse delay, once an embarrassment, was being praised as deliberate brilliance. The Bremen model, they called it. To Karl, it was something else entirely. He felt the tremor of cause and effect like static in the air. Each tick of the clock in his office seemed heavier now. Every machine hum carried a rhythm he no longer trusted. The system had rewarded a mistake because it looked like control. The truth was simpler. A fault had survived because one man refused to erase it. The teleprinter clicked once more, spitting out a brief addendum. Unconfirmed rumor. Allied units refer to ordnance as ghost bombs, devices that wait. He tore the message free, folded it neatly, and held it for a long time before slipping it into his coat. There was no pride in his face, no fear either, just quiet comprehension. The realization that the fuse had done what he'd predicted, and more. Outside, the workday continued with the same mechanical certainty. Cranes turned above the siding. Freight cars creaked along rails, glistening with oil. The air vibrated faintly with the rhythm of engines starting in sequence. The same pattern, the same efficiency, untouched by the knowledge of what it had produced. Karl walked back through the machine hall. Workers greeted him with brief nods, unaware. The presses thundered in perfect unison. None of them knew that one imperfection, small, invisible, and uncorrected, had changed the tempo of an entire front. At his bench, the tool sandbag assembly positioned himself